The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
To begin with, we will have a lecture by Dr. Ruth Wisse, and following the lecture, we will have a showing of two films. One is a short film entitled The Bent Tree, made in 1980, and the second is, of course, A Briveler de Mammon. And once again, I should publicly apologize for my poor Yiddish accent and indicate that I would be delighted to have any of you who are better Yiddish speakers than I correct my accent following this evening's program. I would just like to announce that tomorrow, which is Thursday, September the 12th, at 2 p.m., we will be having in this hall the screening of Der Purimspieler. That's at 2 p.m. At 6 p.m. tomorrow evening, Dr. Eric Goldman will be delivering a lecture in the art gallery adjacent to this hall on similarities and differences in Yiddish film and films made in Hollywood. And finally, at 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, we will be screening Mizrach und Ma'arav, East Meets West, starring Molly Picon. Our festival concludes on Saturday evening at 8:30 p.m. with an appearance, a lecture, and reading by Mr. Isaac Bashevis Singer. Further information for the entire series can be had in the Jewish Omnibus brochure, and of course, tickets are available at the box office. This evening, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Ruth Wisse. Ruth Wisse is professor of Yiddish literature at McGill University in Montreal. She is the author of The Shlemiel as Modern Hero, a frequent contributor to Commentary magazine and to other journals. You will have undoubtedly read her article, which appeared in a recent commentary on Yiddish. And she has just completed a project for Penguin Books, the Penguin Book of Yiddish Poetry. She is the co-editor of that work, together with Irving Howe and Chana Shmerek. The Penguin Book of Yiddish Poetry will be released in 1986. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Wisse.
I've never been backstage since Little Theater days. It's a very formal occasion. Well, the topic here is about the breakdown of the traditional Jewish community. And I think the logical place to begin is with a work written in the final year of the 19th century, a work written by Sholem Yankov Abramovich, the first great genius of modern Yiddish and modern Hebrew literature, who is better known by his pen name, Mendele Mocher Sforim. In the year 1899, after being prodded by a great many of his friends and admirers and editors and publishers, Abramovich began to write his autobiography, and he called this work Shloime Reb Chaim's, Shloime, the son of Reb Chaim. To any reader, this title, Shloime Reb Chaim's, would have signified its traditional intention, because of course Shloime Reb Chaim is not just the way in which a boy was called up to the Torah, which is the way in which that term, that way of addressing someone is used nowadays. But Shloime Reb Chaim's is the way in which a boy was conceived, and not just boys, but girls as well. The very meaning of a traditional community is that one is born into a certain situation, and to be Shloime Reb Chaim's meant not only that one was born a Jew in that community with all the obligations of a Jewish child and then a Jewish adult, but it meant also being born to a certain station within that society with very explicit expectations. The Reb Chaim's, is an honorific title, which immediately tells us that Sholem Yankov Abramovich's father was a very well-to-do and very well-respected householder
in the community of Kapulje in which he lived. Now, in such a traditional community, to follow the teachings of one's fathers meant really, in a very explicit way, to follow the way of one's father, and in many cases, to take up one's father's trade or occupation, one's father's situation, as well as, of course, going to the schools, going to the cheder, following the kind of education that the father prescribed. In fact, in the case of Sholem Yankov Abramovich, his father was his most extended teacher. His father also taught other children in the town and taught his own son. And his son always said that his father was his best and greatest teacher. Now, it's not surprising then that when Abramovich Mendele came to write his autobiography, he should have begun it with an introduction in which he complains, or at least explains to us, that it is simply difficult for him to conceive of writing an autobiography, since the word autobiography, the very concept of autobiography, implies the history of a differentiated individual, whereas, as he puts it, there is no such concept, really, in the world in which he was raised. And he puts it as follows. Let me see. What's so special about my life? What has ever happened to me that makes my life deserve the distinction of being recorded? What has happened to me has happened to thousands of our people. It's a familiar story. Is there any other people in the world among whom the life of every individual, from the moment he comes into the world until his last breath, goes on and on according to a single pattern as it does among us? The way they are reared and educated, the words of their prayers, the tunes of their hymns and liturgical poems are all identical. Even their food and drink are the same. Who has ever heard of a people who at a given hour, say Friday night, all over the globe, are all eating fish, noodle pudding, and vegetable stew, and on Saturday morning, radishes, picha, liver with onions and eggs, and dried out kasha with a marrow bone in it. On one day of the year, kreplach, on another day, hamantaschen, on a third day, the twisted yellow challah with saffron. That, incidentally, was Rosh Hashanah food. At the very moment when someone in Berdichev is singing He Who Sanctifies on the Shabbos Eve, or shouting Chai V'Kayom, He Lives Forever on Rosh Hashanah, the same tune and the same voice reverberate in Argentina at the other end of the world. We are an anthill in which the individual has no existence apart from the community. In books on natural history, scientists devote a separate chapter to the genus of ants as a whole, but not to the individual ant. Now, this is very, very strong stuff, I think, and what Mendele is saying, as we see, is that what was required is really a zoologist, or the human zoologist, the anthropologist, someone who can give a study of a composite community, because a boy who grows up in that kind of traditional world is really like one ant among many ants on the anthill. And so how can one present an individuated portrait? And yet, of course, we know, as we read it, that we are reading Shloime Reb Chaim's, which is an autobiography. And though the author goes to every length to give us this composite picture of a traditional society, the individual, as we will see, eventually breaks through. Now, Shloime Reb Chaim's is a wonderful work, and it is written, as many of these films are made, in a sense, very pictorially. And because of this kind of introduction, we can understand that Abramovich felt responsible to give an accurate picture of how the community as a whole lived, so that, for example, he describes his father's house, how it looked, what its functions were, how this house on the main street and the main market square was also used as an inn for Gentiles on market days and on holidays, how it was used as a synagogue, how it was used as a place of study and a meeting point and a community center on Saturday nights, and how it was even used as a parade ground, military parade ground for the young recruits who had to train in the city. Or another chapter, the most powerful image that he gives us of his mother in the book is really not of her in any differentiated way, but he gives us a scene of the women in the community braiding candles. And, I had never known about this custom until reading about it in this particular work. Apparently, when the women all made candles together, during the process of pulling through the thread through the wax, every candle would be consecrated in some way through a prayer, through a special prayer. And he gives us the texts of some of these prayers. For example, this thread that I weave in the name of our mother, Sarah, may God remember in our favor what she suffered when her dear son Isaac was taken from her and bound on the altar. May she intercede for us before you, O God, that our children not be stolen from us, that they not be led away from us like sheep. Now, this is very poignant, of course, because this was the time, this prayer was being recited at a time when young boys were being rounded up for military service. The Jewish community had to provide a certain quota of young men for service in the Tsarist army, and this caused a tremendous demoralization in the Jewish community because the Jews themselves were made responsible for fulfilling the quota, and if the Tsarist police did not get you, you could be sure that Jewish kidnappers who went around kidnapping boys to fill the quota for particular towns would snatch away boys. It was a real time of panic. And the mothers obviously identify this panic of theirs with the figure of Sarah, of all the biblical figures, the one whom they see as having been in that same desperate situation. So in writing about this, Mendele Mocher concludes the chapter as follows: if anyone can find it in his heart to laugh at this prayer, to mock it, let him do so. But then let him point to souls as pure as these. Let him duplicate these tender feelings, these burning tears, this love of Torah and wisdom, this regard for one's fellow man and all mankind. Now, this, to be sure, is very strongly pitched towards an appreciation of the religious personality and the traditional Jewish way of life. But who is saying these words? And what are their premise? What does it mean when a writer addresses his audience and says, if anyone can find it in his heart to laugh at this prayer or mock it, let him do so? The author clearly knows that he is already speaking as a person and to people who are very far removed from this practice and who regard it as a kind of old-fashioned superstition. And it is because the understanding of author and reader is that this is old-fashioned that the writer can come so strongly to its defense and that he finds it necessary to make a kind of apology for it. There is less than an organic relationship already between the author of this memoir and the community out of which he grew. A great distance now separates them from one another. The greatest single factor, I think, contributing to the breakdown of the traditional community was clearly the sense of individuation, the feeling of the first person singular, who begins to see himself and herself as differentiated from that group. After the fact, many Jews felt that, many of the writers felt that the community in which they had grown up, the community of Jews, had been the most socialized people on earth. And they made this claim on two grounds. One, the most highly socialized people on earth, because of the demands of Judaism itself. Judaism, where even prayer, which is such a personal thing, is a requirement that one, for most prayers, that one pray in minyan, that one pray collectively, and socialized, of course, also because of the negative thrust of Jewish life, that Jews are herded together forcibly because of the oppression from the outside that forces them to live together in communities, that doesn't allow them to live, for example, everywhere in the Tsarist Empire, but really encloses them in certain ghettos and encloses them in certain situations. It seemed to the writers, as they began to distinguish themselves, that this had been a tremendous oppression. Once they were releasing themselves, they marveled at how cohesive, all-defining, comprehensive, and socialized Jewish life had been. But if we take even this one single text, and you read Shlomo Reb Chaim's through to the end, what you find is that no matter how forcibly it announces its traditional intention, nevertheless, it provides us very dramatically with a case of the process, all the steps in the process of self-distinction, of self-differentiation. And just a brief summary, because Mendele does this brilliantly. The first thing that differentiates him from the community, the first moment, as he tells us about it, is when he is in a storm. He's in the middle of the woods, he's gone for a walk in the woods on an afternoon, and a storm breaks out and rages all around him. And he describes how in that moment he knew himself to be unprotected, vulnerable, and totally alone. The second thing which makes him feel himself as an individual is love. And he describes how even as a young boy, he fell intensely in love with a young girl in his neighborhood. And he describes a scene where his mother and other mothers are sitting around discussing this young pair that is flirting. And the mothers, of course, look at it, and what do they see? They begin to talk about a shidduch. Let's arrange a shidduch between these two. For them, it's a social act, it's a social affair. Let's formalize this union and create another new couple, a new household in Israel. But the boy who's running around and who sees what these women are saying and how they feel about it feels very alienated from them, because what he senses is the heartbreak. He senses really the panic of not having his love returned. He feels the isolation of the heart. The third thing that separates him, and we're still talking here of a young boy, is talent. He begins to feel in himself the stirrings of the individual talent, the desire to create, which is a singular sensation. And he realizes that not everybody has this talent or this need to create, the urge to make something out of nothing. And so he begins to feel set apart by those powers that are not granted to others, and by the impulse which is uncultivated in others. And then when he is 12, his father dies, and this is, of course, a situation which repeats itself in these memoirs and repeated itself much more and at a much earlier age than it does in our time. And with the father's death comes the complete collapse in the days before insurance policies of family life. All the things that were once taken for granted must now be renegotiated. The boy's status in the community completely comes to an end. His mother marries a miller, which is a marriage at the other end of the social scale. And so finally, the boy, who cannot be supported at home any longer, sets out to roam the world, and physical distance, as well as psychological distance, begins to separate him from his hometown of Kapulje, the beginnings of wandering and of resettlement. The author then represents his process of individuation through a series of steps that explain in their own way, without really explaining it point by point, but that do persuasively explain how someone who was born Shlomo Reb Chaim's and knew what it was to be just a boy, an ant on the ant hill, should ultimately become an independent author, a creative writer, capable of the act of autobiography. The title signifies the intention of the work, but even if his attitude is one of highest approval and praise and respect and affection and nostalgia and much else, it is distinctly no longer the same as being at one with the tradition of one's fathers. He is now the one who writes about it. And indeed, the breakdown of the traditional Jewish community is only one half of the title of this short talk, actually. The whole of it should read, "The breakdown of the traditional Jewish community is the necessary condition for an individuated art." Because the breakdown of the traditional Jewish community was the necessary condition for creating art, it was necessarily treated with great ambivalence by the writers, who knew that they were the products equally of what they had been, what made them as they were, and what they were no more. And one sees this in most of the movies that are being shown here. The old Yiddish world is the ground of the Yiddish film and the ground of the Yiddish film industry, but the plot of the traditional Jewish film is always the plot of the individual breaking away, challenging or forced to abandon the security in which he or she is raised. A film is a popular art. It tries to touch a common nerve. If you want to make films, you have to be appealing to large masses of people. Literature can afford to be much more radical. It doesn't have to take so large an audience into consideration, and it doesn't have to take it into consideration to the same degree. There are writers who've been satisfied to join these words for 4 people, as Ezra Pound once wrote. So literature can afford to go out on a much longer limb. And we see this very shortly after Sholem Yankov Abramovich's hesitant autobiography. One sees really an enormously radical literature emerging in Yiddish and in Hebrew as well. The examples that I intend to cite this evening all are North American examples, and most of them actually local examples from New York City. One could have taken examples from anywhere, and I thought, why not just take them from the community from which one derives? So to take an example then, by the American Yiddish short story writer and novelist Joseph Opatoshu, written in the year 1913. Now, this story is called Morris and His Son Philip, which already, like the title Shloime Reb Chaim's, tells you something very significant about how far one has come. The names are Americanized, no longer Moshe and Fivush, but Morris and Philip. And it's not just the names, but the title alerts us to something in the relationship of these two people who are no longer defined in terms of one another, Morris and his son Philip. The story dramatizes estrangement. At first, at the beginning of the story, Morris is trying to turn his son Philip into a successful vaudeville actor so that he can send the boy on to stardom. He's trying to teach him how to sing, and he's trying to teach them the ways of the stage. But in a way, it's a very traditional Jewish scene. The father instructing the boy, except that this is a debased version of that tradition. He's no longer teaching him Torah. He's no longer teaching him the perpetuation of the civilized community. What he's teaching him is something which is going to bring them both personal gain. And in fact, the entire story shows you the debasement of all that was once the traditional structure. This father, who is supposed to be bringing up his son and earning a living for him, in fact is a great womanizer, and he falls for the landlady, the person whom they're rooming with, who takes in boarders because her blind husband can't really sufficiently provide for her. The story shows how crude the hunt for personal pleasure has become, how money and sex and fame are the things which have replaced all the other considerations that the Jews supposedly brought with them as values from their European communities, and how, in unrestrained America, nothing restrains them any longer from satisfying, from gratifying these desires. So at the end of the story, by the end of the story, Morris and the landlady run off together. They steal the blind husband's money from under his mattress, and they leave the daughter and Philip, the woman's daughter and Morris's son, together alone. And if you laugh at that, you see how this naturalism forces itself. They even steal the pillows from under the sleeping children's heads. This is a Hansel and Gretel story in which the children really are fatally abandoned. And there's only a little bit of tenderness at the end that these two children begin to feel for one another as they play house, trying to recreate a family situation out of the nothingness that they now experience. So the writer, writing about this in a way, has been freed from bondage, and with great literary energy, he and many others like him show the upending of all the old values, as if the story were really a study of inversions, the ultimate repudiation of tradition, parents who refuse the bond of responsibility for the physical protection, let alone the spiritual upbringing of their children. So not only is it not Shloime Reb Chaim's, but it's really a refusal to even take the minimal sense of caring for one's own offspring. Opatoshu's story is a fable about Hefker, Yiddish word Hefker, the wanton abandonment that has taken over where tradition once maintained civilized rule. And there is a kind of condemnation in his story. There's obviously an implicit moral disapproval in this tale of the new world. But one should say that elsewhere, the abandonment of traditional Jewish community existence released a tremendous exuberance. And I've brought really one example of this, but I think that the example will hopefully prove the whole point. This is a marvelous poem by the interesting, fascinating woman poet Anna Margolin, which was a pen name for Rosa Lebensbaum. Fortunately, there are a number of studies being done at this moment of Anna Margolin's poetry and life, so hopefully something will be published about her in the near future, but she's really an amazing personality. And this is a poem which she set at the very beginning, the first poem in the only book of poems that she ever published. So she obviously thought of it as being quite central to her own career and to her own literary view of herself. And it's called, I'll read it first in Yiddish, it's a difficult poem in any language, and then in an English translation. It's called, Ich bin gewesen einmal a Jüngling. I was once a young boy, I was once a youth. Ich bin gewesen einmal a Jüngling, gehört in Portikos Sokraten. Es hat mein Busenfreund, mein Liebling, gehabt dem schönsten Tors in Athen. Gewesen Cäsar und a helle Welt gebeut von Marmor. Ich der Letzter und für a Weib mir aus der Welt mein stolze Schwester. In Rosenkranz beim Wein bis spät gehört in hochmutigen Frieden wegen Schwachling von Nazareth und wilde Meises wegen Jiden. In the translation by Marcia Falk, and incidentally all these, or maybe not so incidentally, all these poems will be included in the Penguin Book of Yiddish Poetry when it appears. This is entitled Once I Was Young, but more literally, Once I Was a Youth. Once I was young, hung out in doorways, listening to Socrates. My closest pal, my lover, had the finest chest in Athens. Then came Caesar, and a world glittering with marble, I, the last to go, for my bride picked my proud sister. At the late night bashes, soused and feeling fine, I'd hear about the Nazareth weakling and the exploits, the wild exploits of the Jews. Now, in this poem, here is release from the condition of one's birth with a vengeance. The female poet, first of all, imagines herself a male in a society of that most resplendent maleness of ancient Greece, a world of brilliant intellection and the appreciation of male physical beauty and the joy, the wonderful joy in them both. She paints the ideal of Hellenism here, against which Jewish civilization stood firm and, as we know, suffered so very much. But she, or he, this androgynous being here, is one of the Greeks, and very happily, brilliantly one of the Greeks. And then Rome, marble, authority, hedonistic abandon, wanton incest, always had been seen through Jewish eyes as the essence of abomination. But from their high-spirited glory, Greece and Rome, she looks down at the puny Nazarene, at the puny Jesus there in the wild Middle East with its Jews and their desperate customs. The joy of this poem derives from turning the tables on one's own origins, being able to hear in high-spirited pleasure stories about the Jews. And you notice in the Yiddish that only, and even in the English translation too, only in the final word of the poem do we really know where the poet was heading. And that final word really bears the full weight of, I would say, not only disdain, but contempt. So, freed from historical necessity of traditionalism, the poet can even choose her own society and, at least momentarily, enjoy the identity of the most othermost of all others, the antithesis of what she was, in truth. You could bring many anthologies of examples of distancing of this kind, of Yiddish literature which took wild pleasure and great joy in combating, in turning against the restrictions that it had had to endure. I will just give some examples. The fascination of American Yiddish writers with the figure of Jesus, and with the Christian interpretation of Judaism. Writing Itzik Manger, for example, writing a poem about Saint Besht, the Baal Shem Tov made into a saint, in order in some way to play around with the proximity, with the relatedness of Hasidism and Christianity, but also basically to taunt Jewish culture, to flaunt its greatest taboo. And this is something that I know from my own home. As a teenager, it was always wonderful to know that if you really wanted to provoke your mother, and to a lesser degree even your father, there was one surefire way of doing it. You only had to mention Jesus' name at the table, and not even favorably, but in any capacity at all, for all hell to break loose, and to have your rebellion taken seriously. Oh, ingrate! How could you bring that symbol of all that has destroyed us and oppressed us into our home? Well, the fascination with Christianity certainly has this kind of tzalachachis on purposeful rebellion at its heart. Or the fascination of Jewish writers for violence, for the portrayal of violence, which is a great subject in Yiddish literature, with psychic outbursts that had never been tolerated in Jewish culture, and seemed always characteristic of them, of those who are untamed by Jewish civilization. Yiddish literature delights in really getting into the nitty-gritty of how violence feels and how it is perpetrated. The indulgence of rank, sexuality, and sensuality. This is particularly true of the women writers, who seem to be interested in rebelling against the one thing that was most incumbent upon a Jewish woman, modesty. And so you find in the Jewish women writers particularly enormous immodesty, the subject of lust, the subject of sexual perversions, treated quite frankly, and the physical aspects of love singled out as opposed to the spiritual aspects of love that had always been uppermost in the Jewish tradition. Well, as these writers were all busy probing the subject of their freedom from traditions that had once bound and restricted them, history, of course, was assisting the process. It was doing its work very rapidly in destroying the traditional Jewish community. The migrations uprooted millions of Jews, brought them to new continents and to new circumstances. The pogroms, which were a contributing factor to the migrations, the main contributing factor according to some historians, particularly the great Kishinev pogrom of April 1903 and the snowballing pogroms which followed that up to World War I. These destroyed life, and more than life, they destroyed the faith in the possibilities of reconstructing a Jewish life under those same traditional circumstances. The growth of ideologies, powerful attraction for young Jewish thinkers, new ideas of how life should be ordered and of how Jewish life should be ordered. Socialism, Jewish socialism, territorialism, and of course Zionism, all of which thrust themselves against the old order and tried to bring about and to hasten the decline of the traditional Jewish world. And cataclysmically then, the Russian Revolution of 1917, that amazing explosion of light that seemed at a stroke to destroy the old order and to give birth to a radiant new one. Well, here in America, events were not quite as dramatic, but a strange shift began to take place here at a different pace. America was the main gathering point for immigrants. And in short time, within much less than one generation, what had seemed normal began to seem abnormal, and what had seemed abnormal and aberration was now the norm. Briefly put, in America, everyone was set adrift. Everyone was an individuated individual, forced into that solitary struggle for his or her existence. Here you found, not only among the Jews, but across the country, an entire community, you could say, of people set adrift from community. Whereas once, in a case of a boy like Shlomo Reb Chaim's, a few self-selected iconoclasts broke away to show independence, now everyone was forced to stand alone, to make it on one's own. The subject of rebellion against the old securities was virtually redundant. Individuated modern existence was now the new normal condition. Now, Yiddish writers were in a strange situation. They had struggled quite desperately to insist on individuating a language that had developed in order to maintain staunch, separate religious communalism. But in America, that language that signified the traditionalism of the Jewish community was being abandoned because the desire for individual advancement was so dramatic and so universal among the Jews that the Jews felt they could not afford to be hemmed in any longer by a separate traditional Jewish language. So a strange inversion takes place among the writers. To be unique, to be individual within the American framework by the early 1920s means then to reroot yourself in the specific communal identity from which you derive. To be culturally other now means to return to the sources that everybody else is abandoning. Once more, the Yiddish writers, in a sense, were going against the tide, but this time rapidly in the other direction, trying to pluck from the past images of something deeper than momentary satisfaction and more enveloping than individual self-expression. Not that the first person singular, that the I, was really sacrificed. It couldn't be, of course. But the Yiddish writer began to feel bound to that old world that he had and she had dramatically escaped from, and began to feel responsible in a different way for the past out of which they had emerged. They alone, among all the Jews of North America, were the ones who were unable to abandon that tradition, because the very profession of the Yiddish writer meant to be bound to the language of the traditional community. And everyone else, every shoemaker, every manufacturer, every rabbi, could move into English. But the Yiddish writer, by virtue of what he was, alone, was unable to move in that direction, and so became really, reactively in many cases, the purveyor of the culture that in his or her youth they had set out to help to destroy. I will bring here a poem, cite a poem, perhaps, I don't know, just chosen almost at random, a poem by someone from my own community of Montreal, a wonderful poet, Yud Siegel. Siegel came to New York in 1922 to join other poets in a shoemaking cooperative. They thought that as poets they could set up a shoemaking cooperative that would help them make a living and at the same time provide a conducive environment for writing poetry together. The experiment didn't last more than 2 years, and then Siegel returned to Montreal, where he became a teacher in a Jewish day school. And he wrote quite prolifically. And this is a poem called At My Wedding, and the translation here is by Grace Schulman. At my wedding, a jolly blonde musician played at my wedding on a small, quiet fiddle. He played a lament, an old-fashioned, poignant song. Old musicians marveled silently. Where did this blonde fellow pick it up? After all, he lurks in villages night and day, playing at peasant brawls, and can barely trek through a page of Hebrew. He sleeps on a hard couch and eats wherever he happens to be, as when a peasant gives him radishes from her garden. He's a scholar, cunning in the science of cards, with its subtleties, interpretations, and grammar. It was, though, a wonder to look at him. Shoulders and head, nose and ear, laughed magically in joy and sorrow. His thin, bony face rejoiced like a rising well. He played at my wedding, lifting them from their seats, making feet want to fly but stay in place, turning ears into spears. His fingers kissed and tore the fiddle, bit off pieces, and ripped its taut arteries bloody until the old guests pleaded, "Have pity, Habrachmanis." Now, it's a lyrical poem and could be taken, I guess, to represent many things. But in the context of what we're talking about here, it's an interesting poem to be written under the title At My Wedding. Here's a title which, if anything, suggests a personal event, a first-person singular experience, and yet The poem has absolutely nothing to do with, or seems to have nothing to do with, the poet and the day of his marriage. It's actually the description of a cultural event of a specific kind. It's about the artist, this musician, the loner, the outsider. Where did he pick it up? Not a traditionalist, someone who comes from the outside, someone whose specialty is in study, all right, in the interpretation of cards, someone whose life is a travesty of traditional Judaism, and yet, despite his irregularity, his living at the fringes, his shady side, he is really the voice of joy, the force of cohesion, breathing passion into ceremony, stirring the old folks, the main repositories of the tradition, beyond anything that they had anticipated. The artist in this poem comes from the outside to regenerate in the community its appreciation of itself, of its own creation. The wedding in this poem is not so much the wedding of the bride and the groom to the bride. It is the wedding of the artist to his people. And the artist here has a completely new function, the function which he begins to have in Yiddish literature. The function is that of being someone untrustworthy. The old traditional folks say, what? How did he pick up this melody? How does he know it? He doesn't live among us. He doesn't dwell among us. And yet, this very blonde, jolly musician is the one who can make the music strong and powerful enough to move people to the point where they have to say, please stop. I can't bear the emotional intensity of it anymore. Or more explicitly, one last example from the last sonnets of Mani Leib, who is one of the finest of American Yiddish poets. Mani Leib, all his life, struggled to achieve the goal of a finely nuanced individuation. When he came to the United States in the year 1906, he became associated with a group called the Junge, and his name became virtually indistinguishable from the idea of so-called aestheticism, the aesthetic impulse in Yiddish poetry. What was this? He was a poet, among a number of other writers and poets, who wanted to refine Jewish culture, to take it away from its preoccupation with national and social affairs, who wanted Jews to stop being the most highly socialized people on earth. And he wanted to take Yiddish poetry and the Jews with it into a new kind of appreciation of loveliness and of loneliness, of being able to really stand alone, of being able to feel what it is to be unique and other, and not necessarily always a member of one's people or a member of one's class. Many of Mani Leib's poems are really about this subject. How moody I am tonight. The character in the poem is often enclosed in a room. Everyone else is out there walking in the streets, and this character is alone in his room with his own feelings, including feelings of boredom, which is surely one of the most individuating feelings in the world. Or, alternately, everyone else is in their homes, and he sees the lights of New York in a distance, but he, the character out there, is in the streets, pacing the streets, walking restlessly in the streets, always at odds with the other people around him. This, then, is the whole context within which Mani Leib becomes a poet, and this is really the way in which he is known as a poet for the great majority of his literary life. And then, towards the end of his life, at the end of the 1930s and during the 1940s, he begins to write a series of sonnets, which are different, and I would say one could describe almost as a new species of psalms. Poems in which the personal experience is deliberately rerouted in national memory and history. The personal note is strongly there, and some of the poems are still strictly first-person singular confessions and expressions. But even when they are singular and about oneself, they are singular in a dramatic new way. And this is one of the last of the sonnets that he wrote, and it is called, I guess appropriately enough, Inscription on a Tombstone. I read it in both languages, in the translation by John Hollander first. This is Inscription on my tombstone. Here lies Hersh Itzi's son. On his unseeing eyes are shards, in his shroud like a good Jew. He walked into this world of ours as to a yearly fair, from that far town non-being to peddle wind. On a scale, he weighed out all that he owned to a wheeler-dealer friend, got back home to light candles, tired at the end, when the first Sabbath stars had just about curtained his town's sky above all the Jews. Now here he lies. His grave stands, mossed and green, between him and the gray week, as between Sabbath delights and the fair's noisy stews. Great blasts of wind that outlasted him still were all left to children in his will. See what the translator is up against. Aufschrift auf mein Matzeve. Da liegt Herrsch Itzis Sohn mit Scherblach auf die Augen, begraben in Tachrichim wie a schöner Jid. Ries auf unser Welt wie auf a Jorjarid, a rob zu Fuß von weiten Yishuv nicht gesteugen, verkäufen Wind. Hat auf Wogschall abgewogen, sein Hab und Gut a Seucher Mocher a Jedid, und ist zu Lichtbändchen nach heimgekommen Mied, wenn erste Schabbesstern haben schon verzeugen dem Himmel auf sein Yishuv über alle Jiden. Jetzt liegt da, sein Kever Erd mit grünem Moch, is a Mechitze zwischen ihm und greuer Woch und zwischen Tummel von Jarid und Schabbes Frieden. Und hübsche rechten Wind, was is noch ihm verblieben, hat in sein Savoye Kinder abgeschrieben. Now, I think that you can see why this poem, or how this poem really brings us full cycle. When the poet writes this inscription on his tombstone, he lays to rest Hersh Itzi's son. And unlike Shlomo Reb Chaim's, he doesn't even give us his first name. He doesn't even give us the Mani Leib part. Doesn't even tell us what his first name is. Simply Hersh Itzi's son. Allowed to return at last to the original condition of the traditional boy. And incidentally, you may note that he is a traditional boy of a low station. He is not Reb Hersh Itzi's son. There is no honorific title here. He is simply Hersh Itzi's son, the son of a dealer in pelts. The poem is just filled with traditional imagery. He describes himself as a poet, as a dealer, one who went to the market to sell wind, to sell the works of the imagination. And the whole language here is so traditional. When he lays himself to rest, his grave is a mechitze, the traditional separation between men and women in the synagogue. It is that kind of religious separation between the Sabbath and the weekday. And he went to market like a traditional Jew, and he came back in that astonishing image that Mani Leib gives us, saying everything without saying anything explicit, of the Sabbath peace that had finally come to rest upon all the Jews. This is when he comes home. And those treasures of the imagination, which he has not exhausted during his lifetime, well, he ascribes, he gives, he leaves behind to children in his will. Very beautiful poem, a final reckoning by a poet. In one of the obituaries written about Mani Leib, when this poem was, of course, cited this inscription on a tombstone. One of Mani Leib's dear friends wrote a violent protest and said it was so incongruous. Why did they read this poem? There lay the poet, as you might imagine, in his blue serge suit, with his cheeks, rouged, as the morticians here do, and something which is forbidden in traditional, or at least is proscribed in the traditional Jewish burial ritual. What does it mean to say, here lies Hersh Itzi Zun buried in a shroud like a good Jew, over his eyes are shards? This is simply not the case. Well, taken literally, of course, it isn't. And Mani Leib knew very well that he was going to be buried in the Workmen's Circle Cemetery, as were all the Yiddish writers that he knew before him, and several of those who died after him. But in this poem, clearly, he meant to give himself a symbolic burial. And this is what the poem does. It gives him the symbolic burial as a poet who is back in his traditional community as the son of his father, as the son of Hersh Itzi. It seems to me that this situation described here is not all that different from our own in taking part in this kind of a Yiddish cultural festival. I think that we too, as Jews, like to differentiate ourselves from the other millions of individual American citizens among whom we live as individuals, and seek out those cultural traditions that make us unique. We don't return to traditional community life, and very few people, I think few people in a hall such as this, would willingly immure ourselves again in the condition of Shloime Reb Chaim's or of Hersh Itzi's son. The study of Yiddish culture is that kind of symbolic identification with the world before our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers were separated from it. So as the Yiddish writers were the guides to that original separation and differentiation from the traditional Jewish community, so too, ironically, paradoxically, and yet quite effectively, they become the guides to a partial reclamation of the tradition they had once chosen to leave. Thank you. I was going to say if there are any questions, but I guess we've run out of time. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.